February 17th, 1843. Dawn breaks over the arid plains of Sind, and Major General Sir Charles James Napier stands before the most catastrophic decision of his military career. Before him, stretched across 3 miles of Pakistani desert, wait approximately 30,000 Baluchi warriors, the combined armies of the Amirs of Sind. Behind him, exhausted from a forced night march, stand exactly 2,800 British and Indian soldiers. The math is simple and terrifying. He is outnumbered more than 10 to 1. The intelligence is worse than the numbers. These aren't conscripts or reluctant levies. The Baluchi warriors are renowned across Asia as some of the most ferocious fighters on the continent. Men who consider death in battle the highest honor, who have trained with sword and matchlock since childhood, who know this terrain as intimately as their own homes. Their commanders are experienced. Their position is nearly perfect. Anchored on a dry riverbed that serves as a natural fortress, their flanks protected by dense vegetation that will channel any attack into killing grounds. Napier's officers have already presented their assessments. They are unanimous. Retreat is the only rational option. The force is too small, the enemy too numerous, the position too strong. Return to the fortified camp at Hyderabad. Wait for reinforcements. Fight another day when the odds aren't suicidal. But retreat means something far worse than tactical withdrawal. It means the collapse of British power in the region. It means emboldening every potential enemy from Kabul to Calcutta. It means the sacrifice of every Indian village that has allied with the British, whose inhabitants will face massacre the moment British protection disappears. It means validating the worst fears in London, that after the catastrophic retreat from Afghanistan just 1 year ago, where 16,500 souls perished in the snow, the British Empire has lost its nerve in Asia. And Charles Napier, at age 60, understands something his cautious staff officers cannot see. This isn't just about Sind. This is about whether Britain can still project power in India. This is about whether the entire edifice of British authority, built on the perception of invincibility, can survive another demonstration of weakness. This is about whether decades of his own controversial career, his radical ideas, his burning conviction that empires must be won by audacity, not caution, mean anything at all. He looks across the desert at the Baluchi battle lines. His hands, scarred from 5 decades of warfare across 3 continents, don't shake. His decision will determine whether he is remembered as Britain's most brilliant battlefield commander or dies in the most spectacular military disaster since the annihilation in Afghanistan. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this battle changed the trajectory of the British Empire more profoundly than most people realize. Why it demonstrated principles of warfare that remain relevant today, and why the man who won it against impossible odds has been somehow forgotten by everyone except military historians who study the art of turning overwhelming disadvantage into decisive victory. But we can't just jump straight to that desperate dawn in the desert. Without understanding the context, the geopolitical chess game, the recent catastrophes, the convergence of imperial ambitions, the audacity of what Napier attempted becomes impossible to appreciate. Let's go back to 1839, 4 years before our opening scene, and understand how the British Empire found itself in a position where Sind went from irrelevant backwater to absolutely critical. The place to start is Afghanistan. In 1839, British India, governed by the East India Company under the oversight of the British government, controlled a vast swath of the Indian subcontinent. From Bengal to the Ganges Plains, from the Deccan Plateau to the coastal presidencies, British power seemed unshakable. But the men in Government House in Calcutta looked northwest with mounting anxiety. Beyond the Indus River lay Afghanistan, and beyond Afghanistan lay Russia. The Russian Empire was expanding. Year by year, decade by decade, the Tsars pushed their borders south and east. Russian armies conquered the Central Asian Khanates. Russian diplomats appeared in Persian courts. Russian agents traveled through Afghanistan. The British paranoia had a name: the Great Game. The fear was straightforward. If Russia gained influence in Afghanistan, they could threaten India itself. So the British decided on a catastrophically stupid policy. They would invade Afghanistan, depose the current Emir Dost Muhammad, who had shown some willingness to negotiate with Russia, and install their own puppet ruler, Shah Shuja, who had been living in exile in India. It would demonstrate British power. It would create a buffer state. It would check Russian expansion. The First Anglo-Afghan War began in 1839 with approximately 21,000 soldiers, British and Indian troops, plus thousands of camp followers. The initial invasion succeeded. Kabul was occupied. Shah Shuja was installed on the throne. British officers congratulated themselves. Letters home spoke of complete success. Then it all fell apart. The Afghans, it turned out, deeply resented foreign occupation. Resistance grew. British political officers were assassinated. By late 1841, the situation had become untenable. In January 1842, the British attempted to withdraw from Kabul. They negotiated safe passage with Afghan leaders. The result was the most complete military disaster in British imperial history. The retreating column, 16,500 people, including soldiers, officers, camp followers, women, and children, was harassed, attacked, and massacred during a week-long retreat through the snows of the Khyber Pass. Baluchi and Afghan warriors struck from the hills. The cold killed as efficiently as bullets. When the survivors finally staggered toward the garrison at Jalalabad, exactly one man, Assistant Surgeon William Bryden, reached safety. One survivor from 16,500 souls. The shock in London and Calcutta was profound. The British Empire, which had considered itself militarily invincible in Asia, had been utterly humiliated. Every potential enemy from Burma to the Punjab took note. The myth of British invincibility lay shattered in the Afghan snow. This is where Sindh enters the story. Sindh was a region in what is now southern Pakistan, the lower Indus River Valley and the surrounding desert. It was ruled by several emirs, Muslim nobles, who maintained theoretical independence while acknowledging nominal British influence. The region wasn't particularly wealthy. It wasn't strategically vital in peacetime. Before 1842, British officials in India rarely thought about it. But after the Afghan catastrophe, Sindh's value transformed completely. First, geography. The Indus River was the main supply route from the coast to the northwest frontier. If the British needed to send another expedition to Afghanistan, and they did send one in 1842 to rescue prisoners and restore some honor, that expedition would move through or near Sindh. Control of Sindh meant control of the strategic corridor. Second, perception. After the disaster, the British desperately needed to demonstrate that they could still project power. They needed a victory, any victory, to restore the aura of invincibility. Every neighboring state was watching to see if British authority would collapse entirely. Third, security. The emirs of Sindh had been nominally friendly, but their loyalty was based on British strength. After Afghanistan, they began hedging their bets. They were slow to provide supplies. They blocked river traffic. They negotiated with other powers. From the British perspective, unreliable allies on the strategic corridor was intolerable. Fourth, finances. The war in Afghanistan had cost a fortune. The East India Company was hemorrhaging money. Sindh, while not wealthy, had resources. Control meant taxation. Control meant cost recovery. The logic was cynical but pragmatic. Conquest would pay for itself. By early 1842, the British government in India faced a choice. They could accept the diminished prestige from Afghanistan and hope to rebuild slowly, or they could find a way to demonstrate power decisively. Some wanted to reinvade Afghanistan. Others wanted to conquer the Punjab. But there was a third option. Sindh was weaker, closer, and could be taken with fewer troops. The problem was justification. The emirs of Sindh hadn't actually attacked British forces. They were treaty allies, however unreliable. The Governor-General, Lord Ellenborough, needed a pretext. More importantly, he needed a commander willing to execute a morally questionable conquest while making it look like justified military necessity. He needed someone brilliant enough to win against likely numerical disadvantage, aggressive enough to act without endless consultation, senior enough to carry authority, junior enough to be expendable if it went wrong, unconventional enough to not balk at the dubious morality, and preferably someone who already had a reputation for being difficult, so that if the public backlash was severe, he could be blamed personally rather than the government. He needed Charles James Napier, and that's exactly what terrified everyone who knew Napier's history. Because giving Charles Napier independent command in a politically sensitive situation was like handing a brilliant but unpredictable weapon to someone who might use it in ways nobody anticipated. Napier had spent 50 years fighting across 3 continents. He was a hero of the Peninsular War. He had governed territories. He had put down rebellions. He was undoubtedly talented. He was also a radical, a reformer, a man who spoke his mind without regard for consequences, someone who had spent decades enraging superior officers with his opinions on everything from military tactics to social policy. He believed in land reform. He opposed aristocratic privilege. He advocated for the common soldier. He wrote extensively about the obligations of empire, that conquest must be followed by good governance and genuine improvement in the lives of the conquered. In 1842, at age 60, Charles Napier was semi-retired, having spent the previous few years commanding the forces in the northern district of England. He was wealthy enough from his late wife's inheritance to be financially independent. He didn't need another command. He could live comfortably, but Ellenborough knew Napier's psychology. Napier was consumed by duty. Napier believed his military genius had been underutilized. Napier was desperate to prove himself at the highest level before age made it impossible. And Napier, despite his radical politics, was absolutely convinced that British rule could improve the lives of Indians if administered justly. So Ellenborough made the offer. Command of British forces in Sindh, with broad independent authority to handle the situation as Napier saw fit. Napier accepted immediately. He arrived in Sindh in September 1842. He had approximately 5,000 troops, British infantry, Indian sepoys, and artillery. His instructions were deliberately vague. Secure British interests, ensure the Amir's compliance with treaties, use whatever means necessary. What happened over the next 6 months would demonstrate the most controversial aspect of British imperial expansion, the deliberate provocation of conflict to justify conquest. Napier would make increasingly aggressive demands on the Amirs. He would demand they reduce their armies. He would demand territorial concessions. He would demand financial penalties for past non-compliance with treaties. Each demand was technically legal under existing treaties, but interpreted in the most extreme way possible. The Amirs protested, they delayed, they negotiated, they tried to buy time, they didn't want war. Their forces were substantial, but their military equipment was inferior to British arms. But they also couldn't accept unlimited British demands without effectively surrendering their sovereignty. By February 1843, the situation reached crisis point. The Amirs mobilized their armies. Napier declared this mobilization an act of hostility under the treaty terms. He demanded they disarm immediately. When they refused, he declared war. Modern historians debate Napier's role in this escalation. Some argue he was following government policy and merely executing orders to manufacture a pretext. Others argue he independently chose to interpret his instructions aggressively because he believed British rule would benefit the region. The documentary evidence suggests both are true. Ellenborough wanted Sindh conquered, but wanted plausible deniability, and Napier wanted to conquer it because he genuinely believed he could govern it better than the Amirs. The moral complexity doesn't change the military reality. By February 17, 1843, Napier had approximately 2,800 troops with him at his advance position. The emirs had concentrated their forces, estimates range from 28,000 to 35,000 warriors, in a defensive position along the Fuleli River near the small village of Miani. They had chosen their ground carefully. They would make the British attack them in terrain that negated British advantages in artillery and discipline. And Napier had to attack. To retreat would be to admit the entire policy had failed. To wait for reinforcements would give the emirs time to recruit more warriors, potentially bringing the Punjab or Afghanistan into the conflict. To negotiate would demonstrate the exact weakness that had led to catastrophe in Afghanistan. So he would attack with 2,800 men against 30,000. He would cross a dry riverbed, assault prepared positions, and defeat an enemy that outnumbered him more than 10 to 1. His officers thought he was insane. His political superiors in Calcutta would later claim they never authorized such a risky battle. His critics would argue he deliberately created the crisis to force the conflict. But Napier had studied warfare all his life. He had fought in the Peninsular War under Wellington. He had seen how Napoleon turned disadvantage into victory. He had studied Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal, every great captain who had won against numerical odds. And he believed he understood something about warfare that his more cautious contemporaries had forgotten. That morale, leadership, discipline, and aggressive action could multiply combat power far beyond mere numbers. The Battle of Miani would prove whether he was right. There was one man who thought differently about warfare, empire, and duty. But to understand why Charles Napier would risk everything on a single catastrophic battle, we need to understand how 50 years of experience created someone so willing to gamble when others counseled caution. Charles James Napier was born on August 10, 1782, into a military family with a proud but not particularly wealthy lineage. His father, Colonel George Napier, was a career officer. His mother, Lady Sarah Lennox, was the daughter of the Duke of Richmond, which sounds impressive until you realize she had been disinherited for eloping for love rather than making an advantageous marriage. So Charles grew up with aristocratic connections, but without aristocratic money. He would have to make his own way. He and his brothers, William and George, who would also become distinguished officers, were raised in an unusual household. Their mother was intelligent, well-read, and politically radical for her time. Their father had served in the American Revolutionary War and had complex views about empire and duty. The Napier boys were taught that military service was noble, but that nobility required thinking about the purpose of power. You didn't just follow orders blindly. You had an obligation to question whether your actions served justice. This moral seriousness would shape everything Charles did, and would make him deeply unpopular with many superior officers who preferred subordinates who didn't question policy. Charles entered the army at age 12 as an ensign, standard practice for military families who couldn't afford to purchase commissions at higher ranks. He spent his teenage years in Irish garrisons, learning the mundane reality of military life: drill, discipline, paperwork, and the grinding boredom that constituted most of a soldier's existence. His real education in warfare began in 1808 when his regiment was sent to Portugal to fight in the Peninsular War. Napoleon had invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and Britain was fighting to expel French forces. For the next 5 years, Napier would serve under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, learning from perhaps the finest defensive tactician in British military history. The Peninsular War was a brutal school. Napier fought at Corunna in 1809, where he was seriously wounded. He fought at Busaco in 1810. But the battle that defined him was the storm of Ciudad Rodrigo in January 1812. Ciudad Rodrigo was a fortress town. Wellington needed to capture it to continue his advance into Spain. The siege was brutal, weeks of artillery bombardment, sapping trenches closer to the walls, and then the final assault. Napier led his men in the storm, climbing the breached walls under murderous fire. He was shot in the face, the musket ball entering his cheek and exiting through his jaw. He fell from the wall and was left for dead on the battlefield. He survived, though his face would be permanently disfigured and he would suffer chronic pain for the rest of his life. But the experience taught him something crucial: that well-led infantry, attacking with determination, could overcome apparently impossible obstacles. Ciudad Rodrigo should have been impregnable. Proper defensive tactics should have made the walls unassailable. But audacity and determination had prevailed. He returned to combat months later, his wounds still healing. At the Battle of Salamanca in July 1812, he commanded a battalion that took heavy casualties but helped secure Wellington's greatest victory in Spain. Then came Badajoz, another brutal siege where British soldiers stormed the walls with appalling losses. By war's end in 1814, Captain Napier had learned several lessons that would define his command philosophy. First, that defensive positions that looked impregnable could be stormed by disciplined infantry willing to accept casualties to reach the objective. Second, that leadership required personal courage. You couldn't ask soldiers to do what you wouldn't do yourself. He had led from the front at Ciudad Rodrigo and been wounded for it, but his men had followed him through hell because they knew he would share their danger. Third, that most generals were too cautious. Wellington was a genius at defensive warfare, but in Napier's view, he was sometimes too conservative. Napier believed that aggressive action, properly timed, could achieve results that cautious maneuvering never could. Fourth, that tactical skill mattered more than numbers. He had seen small, well-led British forces repeatedly defeat larger French armies through superior discipline, combined arms coordination, and aggressive use of terrain. But the Peninsular War taught him something else, something that would alienate him from many fellow officers and eventually make him controversial in Britain. He had seen what occupation looked like from the occupied side. He had seen Spanish and Portuguese civilians caught between French brutality and British demands for supplies. He had seen how guerrilla warfare emerged from populations who felt they had no stake in the outcome of battles between foreign armies. And he had concluded that if Britain was going to build an empire, and by the 1810s it was clear that Britain was building the largest empire in history, then it had an obligation to govern justly. Conquest without good governance was just robbery. Military power without moral purpose was barbarism. This philosophical conviction would shape everything he did in India decades later. After Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, Napier faced the problem that confronted thousands of British officers. What do you do when the war ends? He was 33 years old, a major with a distinguished combat record but limited prospects for advancement in peacetime. Promotions came through a combination of merit, money, and connections. He had merit, but limited money, and his family's connections were more scandalous than helpful. He spent the next 2 decades in garrison duty, governing territories, dealing with civilian unrest, and increasingly thinking and writing about military theory and social reform. He commanded forces in the Ionian Islands, 1822-1830, where he gained experience in colonial administration. He put down rural unrest in England during the Reform Bill crisis of 1831-1832, an experience that reinforced his belief that social inequality created political instability. He wrote extensively, pamphlets, letters to newspapers, books on military topics. His writings reveal a brilliant but deeply unconventional mind. He argued for army reform, better pay for common soldiers, promotion based on merit not purchase, improved logistics. He argued for social reform, land distribution, voting rights, poor relief. He criticized aristocratic privilege, even though he technically was one. This made him popular with radicals and deeply unpopular with the conservative military establishment. He was seen as brilliant but troublesome, talented but unreliable, useful in a crisis but dangerous to leave in command too long because he would inevitably say something that embarrassed his superiors. By 1839, he was 57 years old and commanding forces in the Northern District of England, essentially a senior but not prestigious post. His combat days seemed over. His wife had died in 1838, leaving him wealthy from her inheritance but emotionally adrift. His brothers had achieved distinguished careers. He had been passed over for major commands because while everyone acknowledged his abilities, nobody wanted to deal with his opinions. Then came the Afghan disaster of 1841 to 1842 and Lord Ellenborough's desperate search for a general to handle Sindh. Napier saw the offer for what it was, a last chance to prove himself at the highest level. He was 60 years old. He would never get another opportunity like this. Yes, the political situation was morally ambiguous. Yes, he was being used as a tool for dubious imperial expansion, but he convinced himself, and his letters suggest he genuinely believed it, that he could conquer Sindh, govern it justly, and improve the lives of its population. He could prove that empire could be moral if administered by someone who cared about justice. Whether this rationalization justified what he was about to do is a question historians still debate. What isn't debatable is that by the time he arrived in Sindh in September 1842, he had already decided he would provoke the emirs into conflict if necessary, conquer the territory, and then implement sweeping reforms. By February 1843, Charles Napier had concluded that the conquest of Sindh must be accomplished immediately and decisively. He had spent 5 months making increasingly aggressive demands, and the emirs had finally mobilized their armies in response. This was the pretext he needed. He had his justification for war, but first he would have to win it. Most commanders thought it was impossible. Napier's own staff officers pleaded with him to reconsider. The military mathematics were unambiguous. 2,800 men facing approximately 30,000 warriors in prepared defensive positions was not a battle. It was a suicide mission. Let's understand the obstacles stacked against him. First, the numbers Napier's force consisted of approximately 500 men of Her Majesty's 22nd Regiment, Cheshire Regiment, experienced British infantry, 400 men of Her Majesty's 25th Regiment, King's Own Scottish Borderers, another British Line Regiment, 1,800 Indian sepoys from various regiments of the Bombay Army, 100 cavalry troopers, mixed British and Indian, 12 artillery pieces with gun crews. Against this, the emirs had mobilized their entire military power. Approximately 30,000 Baluchi warriors, estimates vary from 28,000 to 35,000. 15,000 infantry armed with matchlocks, swords, and shields. 5,000 cavalry, including the feared Baluchi horsemen. 10,000 armed retainers and irregular forces. Several small artillery pieces. The ratio was worse than 10-1. At Waterloo, Wellington had faced Napoleon with near numerical parity. At most famous battles, commanders tried to ensure they had numerical advantage. Here, Napier would be attacking, the most casualty-intensive form of warfare, while outnumbered by more than 10-1. Second, the terrain. The emir's generals had chosen their position with care. They anchored their army along the dry bed of the Fulali River near Miani. The riverbed was about 12 to 15 feet deep with steep banks, a natural defensive wall. An attacking force would have to climb down into the riverbed, cross the sandy bottom under fire, and then climb up the far bank while defenders shot down at them. The emir's left flank was anchored in dense vegetation, a tangled mass of thorn bushes and scrub that was effectively impassable to organized troops. Their right was anchored in an old fort. Between these anchors, their battle line stretched for nearly 3 miles. Behind the defensive line was open ground where their cavalry could maneuver. If the British did somehow cross the riverbed, they would be counterattacked by thousands of horsemen on ground that favored cavalry action. The defensive position was nearly textbook perfect. The British would have to advance across open desert, descend into the riverbed killing ground, and climb under fire, all while being shot at by 15,000 matchlock-armed infantry. Even if only a fraction of those weapons hit their targets, the casualties would be catastrophic. Third, the enemy quality. The Baluchi warriors were not amateur soldiers. They were professional fighters from a warrior culture. Many had trained with weapons since childhood. They were highly motivated. This was their homeland, their way of life, their autonomy. They had nowhere to retreat. They would fight ferociously. Their commanders, particularly Mir Nasir Khan and Hosh Mohammed, were experienced. They had fought tribal wars, suppressed internal rebellions, and studied British tactics in previous encounters. They understood that British power came from disciplined volley fire and artillery. So they had chosen a position that would channel British attacks into killing zones and limit British artillery effectiveness. Fourth, the climate and exhaustion. Napier's troops were exhausted. They had force-marched through the night to reach Miani, covering nearly 20 miles in darkness across desert terrain. They had minimal water and no opportunity for rest. They would be fighting in the heat of a Sin morning, temperatures already climbing toward uncomfortable levels even in February. The soldiers were carrying full combat loads, muskets, ammunition, bayonets, packs. They would have to march several more miles across open ground under observation, then conduct an assault climbing in and out of a riverbed. Fifth, the political stakes. If Napier lost, the consequences would cascade. Every remaining Amir's army in Sindh would mobilize. The Punjab would likely join in. Afghanistan might see an opportunity for revenge. The entire British position in northwest India could collapse. Worse, the psychological impact on the empire would be devastating. After Afghanistan, another major defeat would suggest British power in Asia was finished. Every subject population would consider rebellion. Every potential enemy would see opportunity. Napier was risking his reputation, his career, everything. If he lost, he would be remembered as the fool who gambled away an army. If his force was annihilated, he would share the fate of the commanders who died in the retreat from Kabul, eternal infamy as examples of imperial hubris. But here's the brilliant part. Napier had spent 5 months understanding everything that had just been listed, and he believed he saw something nobody else did. He had studied this enemy. He had read reports of their tactics in previous conflicts. He knew they relied on matchlock muskets, weapons with slower rates of fire than British percussion-cap muskets, shorter range and less accuracy. He knew their artillery was minimal and outdated. More importantly, he understood that their defensive position, while strong, had a critical weakness: length. They had stretched their line across 3 miles to cover all possible approaches. This meant they couldn't concentrate their entire force at any single point. If he could identify where they were weakest and concentrate his entire force there, he could achieve local numerical superiority even though he was outnumbered overall. He also understood psychology. The Emir's forces were composed of warriors from different tribes, commanded by multiple Emirs who didn't have unified command. They were brave individually, but hadn't trained as a cohesive army. If he could break through at one point, the entire line might collapse, each contingent falling back to protect their own Emir rather than maintaining a coordinated defense. His artillery, while only 12 pieces, was vastly superior to anything the Emirs had. British artillery crews were professional, well-trained, and equipped with modern weapons. He could use his guns to suppress sections of the defensive line while his infantry assaulted. His infantry, particularly, the British regiments, were experienced, disciplined soldiers who would maintain formation under fire. The sepoys were well-trained and had proven reliable in previous conflicts. If he could get them across that riverbed, they would deliver devastating close-range volleys and then finish the job with bayonets. And he had seen, in 5 decades of warfare, that audacity often worked precisely because it was unexpected. The Emir's commanders expected a cautious British approach, probing attacks, reconnaissance, waiting for reinforcements. They expected the British to respect the strength of their position. What they wouldn't expect was an immediate, all-out assault by an outnumbered force. So Napier made his plan. He would not wait. He would not probe. He would not retreat. At dawn, he would advance directly toward the enemy position. He would use his cavalry to scout for the weakest point in the defensive line, likely where units from different emirs met, where command coordination would be poorest. He would concentrate his entire force at that point. His artillery would blast gaps in the defensive line at close range. His infantry would then assault, not across the entire line, which would dilute his force, but at a single narrow point where he could mass his firepower. Once through, he would not try to hold. He would pivot left and roll up the enemy line, attacking each defensive position from the flank while it was still facing forward, expecting frontal assault. One section at a time, he would destroy the cohesion of the defensive position. It was an enormous gamble. If his assault was repulsed at the riverbed, his force would be destroyed. If he broke through but then was surrounded by the Baluchi cavalry, his force would be annihilated. If the emir's commanders maintained discipline and coordinated a counterattack, he would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But if it worked, if surprise, concentration of force, superior firepower, and aggressive execution all came together, he could win the most lopsided victory in British military history in India. His officers remained skeptical. Major Henry Tucker, commanding the artillery, pointed out that they had ammunition for perhaps 2 hours of heavy fighting. After that, the guns would be silent. Captain John Jacob, commanding the cavalry, noted that 100 horsemen could do almost nothing against 5,000 enemy cavalry if things went wrong. Napier listened to all objections. Then he explained something that reveals his understanding of warfare. "Gentlemen, the emirs expect us to be cautious because we are outnumbered. They expect us to maneuver, to probe, to wait. Therefore, we will do the opposite. We will attack immediately, with everything, at the point of maximum concentration. Either we will break their army before noon, or we will die trying, but we will not retreat." That night, February 16th, 1843, Napier ordered his force to prepare for battle. The troops were given what rest was possible, though with the emir's army visible in the distance, few slept well. Ammunition was distributed. Officers checked their men's weapons. The artillery crews checked their guns and calculated firing angles. Napier himself walked through the camp, speaking with his soldiers. This was characteristic of his leadership style. Wellington would never have done this, considering it beneath the dignity of a general. But Napier believed soldiers fought better when they understood their commander cared about them personally. He told them honestly what they faced. He didn't minimize the odds. He explained that they were outnumbered, but that he believed they would win because they were better trained, better equipped, and better led. He promised that if they followed orders, maintained discipline, and attacked with determination, they would achieve victory against all probability. The soldiers believed him, not because the odds were good, the odds were terrible, but because this general had personally walked among them, met their eyes, and promised to share their danger. And because Charles Napier, at 60 years old, with 5 decades of combat experience and wounds across his body, had a reputation for winning. At 3 a.m. on February 17th, the force began to move. The march was conducted in darkness, using the stars for navigation. They moved quietly, no talking, equipment muffled, only the sound of 2,800 men moving across sand. By 6 a.m., as first light broke, they were in position facing the emir's army. The time had come. On the evening of February 16th, as the sun set over the Sindh desert turning the sky blood red, Napier gave his final orders. The army would march at 3 a.m. They would advance in attack formation from the beginning, no column of march that would require deployment later. Every minute would count. They would march in darkness to achieve surprise and avoid the worst heat of the day for the battle ahead. His force consisted of 3 infantry brigades, organized for maximum flexibility. The 1st Brigade, commanded by Major William Whitlock, comprised 6 companies of the 22nd Regiment and several companies of sepoys, about 800 men total. This was his strike force, the hammer that would break the emir's line. The 2nd Brigade, under Major John Tucker, brother of the artillery commander, consisted of the 25th Regiment and additional sepoy companies, approximately 700 men. They would support the 1st Brigade and exploit any breakthrough. The 3rd Brigade, commanded by Captain John Jacob, included the remaining sepoys and the small cavalry force, about 1,300 men. They would guard the flanks and be ready to exploit success or cover a retreat if necessary. The 12 artillery pieces, commanded by Major Henry Tucker, would move with the 1st Brigade. Napier intended to push his guns forward aggressively, an unusual tactic. Most commanders kept artillery behind the infantry for safety. Napier wanted his guns close enough to blast holes in the enemy line at point-blank range before the infantry assault. At exactly 3 a.m., the column began to move. The night march was eerie. The desert stretched in every direction, visible only in starlight. The men moved in near silence. A trained army knows how to march without unnecessary noise. Officers checked compasses and navigated by the stars. Behind them, their campfires continued to burn, deliberately left alight to deceive the emirs into thinking the British force was still encamped and would not move until daylight. By 5 a.m., they had covered 8 miles. The first grey light of pre-dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. Napier ordered a brief halt to check formation and allow the men to drink water. They were carrying minimal supplies, only ammunition, weapons, and enough water for a day. Everything else had been left behind. Win or die quickly, there would be no prolonged engagement. At 5:30 a.m. they resumed the march. Now they could see the ground ahead. The desert was relatively flat, but broken by scattered thorn bushes and occasional undulations. The dry riverbed of the Fulele was still invisible, hidden by the gentle rise of ground ahead. By 6 a.m., as true dawn broke, they crested the rise and saw their objective. Spread before them across 3 miles of desert, the Emir's army waited. The sight must have been both magnificent and terrifying. 30,000 warriors, their battle line marked by banners and standards, the morning sun glinting off weapons and armor. The matchlock-armed infantry were formed in dense masses along the riverbed. The cavalry waited in reserve, thousands of horsemen ready to exploit any opportunity. The scale of it was overwhelming, a sea of humanity waiting to crush the small British force. Napier studied the position through his telescope. His cavalry scouts, who had ridden ahead, returned with reports. The enemy left flank was indeed anchored in dense vegetation, impassable. The right flank was anchored on an old fort. But in the center, where the battle line ran along the riverbed, there were variations in the defensive strength. The weakest point appeared to be where several emirs' contingents met, about 1 mile from the left flank. The riverbed was narrower there, the banks less steep. More importantly, there was a visible gap between different contingents' battle lines, perhaps only 100 yards, but enough to suggest imperfect coordination between commanders. That would be his point of attack. Napier turned to his brigade commanders and gave his orders. The 1st and 2nd Brigades would advance directly toward that center position. The artillery would move forward with them, deploying at the riverbed's edge to provide covering fire. The 3rd Brigade would refuse the left flank, moving slower to guard against enemy cavalry attempting to outflank. Then he gave the order that would define the battle. "We will not halt. We will not deploy under fire and waste time. We advance in battle order. We concentrate at the chosen point, and we assault immediately. Speed and concentration are everything." At 6:30 a.m., the British force began its advance across the open desert toward the enemy position. The Emir's commanders watched this approach with growing confusion. The British force was tiny, clearly outnumbered, yet it was advancing in battle order directly toward their strongest defensive position. Where were the rest of the British forces? Where were the flanking columns? Where was the caution? Some of the Baluchi commanders began to suspect a trick. Perhaps this small force was bait to draw them out, and the main British army was somewhere else, waiting to ambush them. Perhaps there were British reinforcements hidden beyond the horizon. The audacity of the advance seemed to suggest the British knew something the Emirs didn't. This uncertainty would prove tactically significant. Instead of immediately ordering their cavalry to attack the small advancing force in the open, where they would have been vulnerable, the Emir's commanders held their troops in the defensive position, waiting to understand the British plan. By 7 a.m., the British force had advanced to within a mile of the riverbed. The ground sloped gently downward toward the defensive line. The distance closed. 1,000 yards, then 800, then 600. At 600 yards, the Emir's artillery opened fire. A few small guns, poorly aimed, their shots falling harmlessly around the advancing British. Napier's troops maintained formation, advancing steadily. At 400 yards, the matchlock-armed infantry began firing, thousands of weapons, their smoke adding to the growing haze of gunpowder. But matchlocks at 400 yards were wildly inaccurate. Most shots missed entirely. A few men fell, but the advance continued. The British troops were now fully committed. There could be no retreat across open ground while under fire. They would reach the riverbed or die trying. At 200 yards, Napier ordered his artillery forward at the gallop. The 12 guns raced ahead of the infantry, their crews brilliant in their handling. They deployed at the very edge of the riverbed, point-blank range, and immediately opened fire with round shot and canister. The effect was devastating. Round shot, solid iron balls, plowed through the massed Baluchi infantry. Canister, tin cans filled with musket balls that turned cannon into giant shotguns, swept away entire sections of the defensive line. At this range, British artillery was murderously effective. The Emir's infantry tried to return fire, but matchlocks take time to reload. Between shots, the British guns fired again and again. Within minutes, the defensive line directly opposite the artillery position was shattered, bodies piled where once there had been formed ranks. Napier seized the moment. He ordered the 1st Brigade forward. Major Whitlock led his men down into the riverbed at 7:30 a.m. They descended the near bank in good order despite the steep slope. They crossed the sandy bottom, perhaps 50 feet wide at this point, while under fire from both flanks. Men fell. Officers shouted orders to maintain formation. Then they were climbing the far bank, scrambling up while Baluchi defenders shot down at them. This was the critical moment. If the assault stalled here, trapped in the riverbed with defenders on both sides, the 1st Brigade would be annihilated. Everything depended on momentum. The British infantry reached the top of the far bank. They were trained for exactly this situation, having fought in the Peninsular War sieges where storming breaches required the same desperate determination. The front rank fired a devastating volley at point-blank range into the Baluchi defenders. Before the smoke cleared, they charged with bayonets. Baluchi warriors are brave men. They didn't break immediately. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along a narrow front. Bayonets against swords, musket butts used as clubs, men grappling in the smoke and confusion. For several minutes, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then the 2nd Brigade reached the riverbed, adding their weight to the assault. 700 more men crossing under fire, climbing the bank, adding their firepower and momentum. The Baluchi defenders, brave as they were, had never faced this kind of disciplined assault. The British troops maintained formation even in close combat. Officers stayed with their men, directing fire and movement. The sepoys fought with equal determination. They were professional soldiers, and they knew that defeat meant death for all. At 7:45 a.m., the Baluchi defense at the breach point collapsed. The warriors fell back from the riverbed, their formation disrupted by casualties and shock. The British infantry poured through the gap. Napier had achieved the breakthrough, but the battle was far from over. They had penetrated the first defensive line, but 30,000 warriors surrounded them. Now came the second phase of his plan, the rolling attack. The situation at 7:45 a.m. was both an incredible achievement and desperately dangerous. Napier's force had breached the Emir's defensive line at the cost of perhaps 100 casualties, far fewer than anyone expected, But now they were through the riverbed with the Baluchi army on 3 sides. 30,000 warriors, their defensive position breached but their fighting spirit intact, were regrouping to counterattack. This is where Napier's planning and the training of his troops would be tested at the highest level. He did not order his men to consolidate the breach and defend. That would have been the conventional move. Establish a foothold, bring up reinforcements, gradually expand the penetration. But conventional tactics would allow the Emir's commanders to organize a coordinated response, bringing their overwhelming numbers to bear. Instead, Napier ordered an immediate left wheel. The 1st Brigade would pivot and attack along the riverbed line, striking the next Emir's contingent from the flank. The 2nd Brigade would follow, maintaining the momentum. The artillery would be manhandled forward, physically pushed and pulled by the gun crews to new positions where they could continue to provide support. This maneuver, attacking along the enemy line rather than perpendicular to it, was tactically brilliant and operationally terrifying. The British force would be exposed on multiple sides. If the Baluchi cavalry charged now, the British infantry could be caught in column and destroyed. If any of the Emir's contingents maintained discipline and refused to retreat, the British advance would stall. But Napier understood something crucial. The Emir's force was not a unified army with a single command structure. It was a coalition of tribal contingents, each loyal to their own Emir, each concerned primarily with their own survival. When attacked from an unexpected direction, from the flank rather than the front, each contingent's natural instinct would be to fall back to protect their own position rather than coordinate with neighboring units. At 8 a.m., the British force began its rolling attack along the riverbed line. The scene defied simple description. Imagine a battle line 3 miles long with thousands of warriors holding defensive positions. Now imagine a relatively small British force, perhaps 1,500 men at the point of attack, striking not across the line but along it, like a hammer moving down an anvil. Each Emir's contingent faced the same tactical problem. They were formed to defend against frontal attack across the riverbed. Their weapons and attention faced outward. When the British attacked from their flank, from their right side, where they had no prepared defenses, they had to refuse their line, turning to face the new threat while still worrying about attacks from the front. The first contingent hit by the flanking attack was commanded by one of the junior Emirs. His warriors fought bravely, but they were caught in an impossible situation. British artillery had advanced to within 100 yards and was firing canister directly into their formation. British infantry delivered volleys from close range. Individual warriors charged forward, meeting British bayonets. Small groups tried to organize resistance, but the training and discipline of British troops told. After 15 minutes of brutal close combat, this contingent broke and ran. Hundreds of warriors fleeing across the open ground behind the riverbed, pursued by British cavalry, who finally had an opportunity to contribute. Captain Jacob's small cavalry force, 100 men against thousands, couldn't destroy the fleeing warriors, but they could harass them, prevent them from rallying, and create panic. The collapse of one contingent threatened the next. Napier's force immediately attacked the adjacent defensive position, striking again from the flank before the defenders could reorient their line. This second contingent held longer. Their commander, Hosh Mohammed, was a capable officer who understood what was happening. He tried to refuse his line, bending his defensive position back to create a corner that could face both front and flank. His warriors fought fiercely, and for perhaps 20 minutes they held their ground. But they were fighting 2 battles simultaneously, defending their front against the possibility of attack across the riverbed, and defending their flank against the actual British assault. The British, by contrast, were fighting one focused battle. Napier concentrated his artillery, his best infantry, and all his tactical attention on this single position. The mathematics of concentration were devastating. At the specific point of British attack, they achieved local numerical superiority despite being outnumbered overall. Perhaps 800 British soldiers attacking 1,500 Baluchi warriors sounds like bad odds. But when those 800 are concentrated in a 100-yard frontage with artillery support, while the 1,500 are spread across 400 yards trying to defend two directions, the advantage shifts. At 8:30 a.m., Hosh Mohammed's contingent also broke. The warriors retreated in better order than the first contingent. They fell back deliberately, rather than routing, but they retreated nonetheless. The British captured their position along the riverbed. Now the Emir's entire defensive strategy was collapsing. The British had penetrated the line and were rolling it up, one contingent at a time. Each Emir's commander faced an impossible choice: stand and be destroyed by flanking attack, or retreat and potentially be blamed for cowardice. Mir Nasser Khan, commanding the largest contingent near the center of the line, decided on a different approach: counterattack. If the British could be stopped, pushed back, perhaps even destroyed, the day could still be saved. At 8:45 a.m., approximately 5,000 Baluchi warriors, infantry and cavalry combined, charged toward the British position. This was the moment of maximum danger for Napier. His force was strung out along the riverbed, having just fought through two major defensive positions. His men were exhausted. Ammunition was running low, and now thousands of fresh warriors were charging toward them. Napier's response demonstrated both his tactical skill and his understanding of infantry warfare. He ordered his brigades to form square, the classic anti-cavalry formation where infantry form a hollow square, with ranks facing outward, creating a hedgehog of bayonets that cavalry cannot penetrate. But he modified the standard square formation in a crucial way. Instead of a single large square that would be a static target, he formed three mutually supporting smaller squares that could provide covering fire for each other. Each square included both British and sepoy troops, mixing his most experienced soldiers with his Indian troops to share the psychological burden of standing firm against a cavalry charge. The Baluchi cavalry charged home, and here the quality of the warriors showed. These weren't reluctant conscripts. They were professional cavalrymen who rode directly into musket fire, seeking to break the British squares through sheer momentum and courage. The British infantry held. This was what they trained for. The front rank knelt with muskets leveled, bayonets fixed. The second rank stood, muskets aimed over their comrades' shoulders. The third rank prepared to reload. As the cavalry closed to within 50 yards, the order came: front rank, fire. Second rank, fire. The volleys were devastating. Horses and riders crumpled, but the Baluchi cavalry kept coming, swerving around the fallen, seeking any gap in the formation. Some warriors reached the bayonet line. Hand-to-hand combat erupted, sabers against bayonets, warriors trying to pull British soldiers out of formation. The British squares held. Barely. At one corner of the 1st Brigade's square, Baluchi cavalry broke through the line, creating panic. Major Whitlock personally led a countercharge, plugging the gap with his own body. He was wounded, a sword cut across his shoulder, but the line reformed. At another square, the 25th Regiment's formation wavered when their commanding officer fell wounded. For a moment, it seemed the square would disintegrate. Then a young subaltern, Lieutenant Timothy Ferris, fresh from England and in his first major battle, took command. He held the line through sheer force of personality, shouting orders and physically dragging men back into formation. The Baluchi infantry then struck the squares. Warriors charged forward with matchlocks, fired at point-blank range, then tried to storm the formation with swords and shields. They were met with volley fire and bayonets. Dead and wounded piled around the British squares. For 15 minutes, the outcome was in doubt. The British squares were islands of disciplined firepower in a sea of Baluchi warriors. If any square broke, the entire British force would likely be destroyed. Once formation was lost, the outnumbered British troops would be overwhelmed. But the discipline held. British officers moved among their men, steadying nerves, directing fire, leading by example. The sepoys fought with equal determination. They knew that defeat meant death for all, and they trusted their officers. The artillery, now positioned within the squares, continued firing canister at close range, creating zones of death around each formation. At 9:15 a.m., the Baluchi counterattack collapsed. The warriors fell back, not from cowardice, but from sheer losses. They had suffered appalling casualties attacking prepared infantry in square. The ground around the British formations was carpeted with bodies. But while Mir Nasser Khan's counterattack had failed, it had bought time for the rest of the Amir's army to reorganize. The defensive line had been breached and rolled up, but perhaps 20,000 warriors remained effective. If they could launch a coordinated attack with their full, remaining strength, the exhausted British force might finally break. Napier understood this. His troops were exhausted, many wounded, ammunition running low. The artillery crews had been firing continuously for over 2 hours and were down to their last rounds. The infantry had fought through 2 defensive positions and repulsed a major counterattack. They couldn't sustain this intensity much longer, so he made the most audacious decision of the entire battle. He ordered an all-out attack on the Amir's remaining positions. This decision violated every principle of caution. His force was outnumbered, exhausted, and running low on ammunition. The conventional military doctrine was clear: consolidate, defend, wait for the enemy to expend himself in attacks against prepared positions. But Napier understood that the Amir's army, while still numerically superior, was psychologically shaken. They had seen their defensive line breached. They had seen contingent after contingent defeated or driven back. They had launched a major counterattack and failed. Morale was fracturing. If the British attacked now, immediately, with maximum aggression, the entire Baluchi army might break before they could coordinate another resistance. At 9:30 a.m., the British squares reformed into line and advanced. The 3rd Brigade, which had been guarding the flank and was relatively fresh, now moved forward as the assault force. Captain Jacob led them toward the Amir's remaining center positions. The 1st and 2nd Brigades, exhausted but still functional, provided covering fire and prepared to exploit any breakthrough. The Baluchi warriors, seeing the tiny British force advancing toward their still massive army, were shocked. They had thrown thousands of warriors against these British squares and been repulsed. Now, instead of consolidating their defensive success, the British were attacking again. The psychological impact was profound. Armies break not when they suffer casualties. Armies can endure tremendous losses if they believe victory is possible, but when they lose hope that continued fighting will succeed. The Baluchi warriors had fought bravely all morning. They had suffered heavy casualties, and now the enemy, who should have been exhausted and desperate, was attacking with apparently unshaken confidence. All across the remaining Amir's positions, contingents began to waver. Local commanders looked around for support from neighboring units, but everyone was waiting for someone else to hold firm. The coalition nature of the force, multiple Amirs, each commanding their own contingent with no unified command structure, meant there was no supreme commander who could order everyone to stand. At 9:45 a.m., the Amir's army began a general retreat. It started with individual contingents falling back to better positions. Then others followed. Within minutes, what had been a fighting retreat became something closer to a rout. Thousands of warriors streaming away from the battlefield, their formation dissolved, each contingent looking to its own survival. The British cavalry finally had their opportunity. Captain Jacob's small force couldn't destroy the retreating army, but they could pursue, harass, and prevent any organized rally. They rode through the fleeing warriors, cutting down those who didn't run fast enough, capturing standards and weapons, spreading panic. By 10 a.m., the Battle of Miani was effectively over. The Amir's army, 30,000 strong at dawn, had been completely defeated by 2,800 British and Indian troops. The battlefield was chaos. Thousands of bodies, wounded warriors crying out, captured equipment scattered across the desert, and the British force, exhausted but victorious, maintaining formation, even in triumph. Napier, his uniform covered in dust and powder smoke, his face showing the strain of 4 hours of intense combat and command, surveyed the battlefield. He had won. Against odds that made the victory seem nearly impossible, through aggressive tactics that violated conventional wisdom, by demanding everything from his troops and receiving it, he had achieved perhaps the most lopsided victory in British military history in India. But first, he had to secure the victory and count the cost. In the aftermath of battle, as smoke drifted across the desert and the morning sun climbed higher, Napier rode across the battlefield taking stock of his victory. The scene was both triumphant and horrific, as every battlefield is when the fighting stops and you can finally see what war actually costs. The British casualties were, given the scale of the battle, remarkably light but still painful. Final counts would show 62 soldiers killed, 32 British, 30 sepoys, 194 wounded, varying from minor injuries to mortal wounds, 5 officers killed, 12 wounded, total casualties, approximately 256 out of 2,800 engaged, roughly 9% losses. Among the dead were men Napier had spoken with the night before, Lieutenant Marston of the 22nd Regiment, who had led his company through the initial breach, killed by a musket ball through the chest. Havildar Ram Singh of the sepoy contingent, who had rallied his men during the cavalry charge, cut down by a Baluchi saber. Each represented a person, a life, a family that would receive devastating news in the coming months. The wounded were everywhere. British medical officers moved among them, triaging who could be saved, offering what comfort they could to those who couldn't. The screams of wounded men being treated without anesthesia, just whiskey and something to bite down on, filled the air. Napier ordered every available soldier not on guard duty to help carry wounded to the surgeons. The Baluchi casualties were appalling. Exact numbers were never determined, but estimates suggest between 5,000 and 6,000 killed on the battlefield. Perhaps 1,000 more who died from wounds in subsequent days. Thousands wounded, total casualties likely, approaching 8,000, 10,000 out of 30,000. Engaged, the sheer scale of the Baluchi losses reflected both their courage and the lethality of modern British firepower. These warriors had attacked prepared infantry squares, had stood against artillery at close range, had fought hand-to-hand rather than retreat. They were brave men defending their homeland, and they paid the price that brave men always pay when courage meets superior firepower and discipline. Napier made a point, recorded by multiple witnesses, of ordering that the Baluchi wounded receive the same medical care as British wounded. This was unusual. Many colonial commanders would have prioritized their own troops exclusively. But Napier's conviction that empire required justice extended even to the battlefield. He told his medical officers, they fought with courage, they deserved to be treated with honor. The battlefield itself was a scene of devastation. Along the 3-mile line of the riverbed, bodies lay where formations had stood. The ground was torn by artillery fire. Abandoned weapons, broken equipment, blood-stained sand stretched in every direction. The smell was already becoming overwhelming: blood, gunpowder, death. British troops gathered captured equipment, thousands of matchlock muskets, swords, shields, several small artillery pieces, numerous battle standards and banners belonging to different emirs. The logistical haul was substantial. The symbolic importance was greater. These captured standards would be sent to England as trophies, physical proof of the scale of the victory. By noon on February 17th, Napier had established a secure camp on the battlefield. Guards were posted. The wounded were being cared for. Burial details were beginning the grim work of dealing with thousands of bodies in the desert heat. Water was being brought up for the exhausted troops. Then, Napier did something that surprised his officers. He summoned his senior staff and dictated a message to be sent to the Governor-General in Calcutta. The message was brief and would become famous, though possibly apocryphal. Peccavi, Latin for I have sinned. The pun was obvious. Peccavi sounded like I have sinned. Whether Napier actually sent this message or whether it was invented later by a Punch magazine reporter remains debated. What isn't debated is that Napier understood the political implications of what he had just done. He had provoked a war, won a spectacular victory, and conquered a territory. Now came the complex task of justifying it. The immediate strategic consequences were clear. The emir's military power had been broken. 3 of the 4 main emirs were either dead or in flight. Their armies had been scattered. Sindh lay open to British occupation, but 2 other emirs, Mir Sher Mohammed and Mir Shahdad Khan, had not been present at Miani. They were gathering forces in other parts of Sindh. The conquest was incomplete. Napier, despite his victory, understood he couldn't rest, had to secure his position, consolidate control, and deal with any remaining resistance before it could organize. With barely time for his exhausted troops to recover, he began planning the next phase of the campaign. Over the following weeks, he pursued the remaining emir's forces. On March 24, 1843, he fought the Battle of Hyderabad, also called the Battle of Dobba, another engagement where he was outnumbered but won through aggressive tactics. This second victory completed the conquest of Sindh. By April 1843, all the emirs had either surrendered or fled. Sindh was now British territory. Napier was appointed as the first governor of Sindh, with authority to administer the newly conquered province. His military achievement was recognized immediately. In Britain, despite some political controversy over whether the war had been justified, the purely military aspects of the victory were celebrated. Napier was promoted to lieutenant general. He received awards and honors. His tactical victory at Miani was studied in military academies as an example of how to win against superior numbers. In India, the impact was profound. After the disaster in Afghanistan, British military prestige had been shattered. The conquest of Sindh, particularly the spectacular victory at Miani, restored the sense that British arms were invincible. Every potential enemy from Burma to the Punjab took note. The message was clear. British forces, when properly led, could defeat overwhelming numbers, but Napier was already looking beyond military victory. He had conquered Sindh partly because he believed he could govern it better than the emirs. Now he had to prove it, but the true significance of the Battle of Miani and the conquest of Sindh went beyond immediate celebrations and military accolades. What Napier did in the months and years following the conquest would define his legacy far more than the battle itself, and would raise profound questions about empire, justice, and the morality of military conquest. Napier took his role as governor of Sindh with intense seriousness. He had justified the conquest partly by arguing that British rule would improve the lives of the population. Now he had to deliver on that promise, or admit that the conquest had been nothing more than imperial aggrandizement. His first actions revealed his priorities. First, abolishing slavery and forced labor, Sindh, under the emirs, had maintained extensive systems of slavery and bonded labor. Napier issued proclamations abolishing all forms of slavery immediately. This was politically risky. Many of the local elites who he needed to administer the province benefited from slave labor. But Napier was uncompromising. He established enforcement mechanisms, sent troops to liberate enslaved people, and prosecuted anyone who tried to maintain the practice. One incident illustrates his approach. A wealthy landowner was found keeping slaves despite the proclamation. Napier didn't just fine him, he confiscated his property, redistributed the land to the former slaves, and publicly humiliated the landowner to make an example. The message was clear. British rule meant genuine change, not just a change of masters. Second, land reform and taxation. The emir's tax system had been extractive and arbitrary. Peasants paid massive taxes while aristocrats paid little. Napier commissioned detailed surveys of land ownership and productivity. He implemented a reformed tax system based on actual land value and agricultural output. He lowered taxes on small farmers and increased them on large landowners. This was economically rational but politically explosive. The local elite, who might have been natural allies of British rule, instead found themselves facing reduced power and increased taxation. Napier didn't care. He believed that sustainable rule required popular support from the mass of the population, not just collaboration with elites. Third, infrastructure development. Napier understood that economic development required infrastructure. He began construction of roads to connect major cities and facilitate trade. He improved irrigation systems to increase agricultural productivity. He established police forces to reduce banditry. He built schools, controversial because he insisted they be open to all castes and religions, not just elites. The scale of the infrastructure program was unprecedented. Napier used army engineers and soldiers not needed for garrison duty as construction workers. He diverted tax revenue into public works rather than shipping it all to Calcutta. This violated East India Company policy. Governors were supposed to maximize revenue extraction, not spend it locally, but Napier argued that developed provinces generated more revenue long-term than exploited ones. Fourth, legal reforms. He established a judicial system that was, by the standards of British India, remarkably fair. He insisted that British officials were subject to the same laws as Indians, another radical position. He created courts where peasants could seek redress against landlords. He prosecuted British soldiers and officials who abused their power. One famous case involved a British officer who had beaten an Indian servant. Most governors would have quietly transferred the officer to avoid scandal. Napier court-martialed him publicly, convicted him, and dismissed him from service. He then personally apologized to the servant's family. The message was unmistakable. British rule meant justice, not just domination. Fifth, cultural respect and religious freedom. Unlike some British administrators who viewed Indian culture as inferior, Napier was careful to respect local customs that didn't violate his core principles. He allowed Muslim courts to handle family law. He protected mosques and religious sites. He hired local administrators and trained them in modern governance. He learned Urdu to communicate directly with the population rather than always using translators. However, he was uncompromising on practices he considered abhorrent. He banned sati, widow burning, and worked to suppress it throughout his jurisdiction. He prosecuted honor killings. He protected religious minorities, particularly Hindus in a predominantly Muslim region, from discrimination. The results of Napier's governance were mixed but generally positive. Economically, Sindh prospered under his administration. Agricultural production increased, trade expanded, tax revenue grew, not because rates increased, but because the economy developed and tax evasion decreased. By 1847, 4 years after conquest, Sindh was generating surplus revenue that could support continued development. Socially, the transformation was profound. The abolition of slavery freed thousands. Land reform gave many peasants actual ownership of land they had farmed as tenants. Education expanded slowly but genuinely. Legal protections gave ordinary people recourse against powerful elites. Politically, Napier's approach created both support and opposition. The mass of peasants and laborers benefited from his policies and generally supported British rule. The traditional aristocracy resented losing their privileges and remained potential sources of resistance. British officials in Calcutta were uncomfortable with his independent approach and his spending on local development rather than maximum revenue extraction. But beyond Sindh specifically, the conquest had broader strategic implications. First, restoration of military prestige. The victories at Miani and Hyderabad restored British military prestige after the Afghan disaster. This had cascading effects. The Punjab's Sikh rulers, who had been considering whether to test British strength, decided against conflict. Burma chose not to provoke another war. Across India, potential enemies reconsidered their options. Second, strategic control of the Indus. British control of Sindh meant control of the Indus River Valley, the main route from the sea to the northwest frontier. This would prove critical in subsequent conflicts. When Britain fought wars in Afghanistan, Second Anglo-Afghan War in the 1870s, the supply lines ran through Sindh. When British power extended to the Punjab, Sindh was the secure rear area. Third, model for later conquests. Napier's approach to conquest and governance became a model, both positively and negatively, for later British expansion. The positive aspects: aggressive military tactics to achieve quick victory, followed by relatively just administration. The negative aspects: manufacturing pretexts for war, provoking conflict to justify annexation. When the British conquered the Punjab in the late 1840s, they followed a similar pattern: provoke conflict, win quick military victory, implement reforms. The similarity was not coincidental. Napier's success had demonstrated that the approach worked. Fourth, personal legacy. Napier served as a governor of Sindh until 1847. He then briefly served as Commander-in-Chief of India, 1849 to 1850, before retiring due to age and health issues. He returned to Britain and lived until 1853, dying at age 70. During his remaining years, he continued to advocate for military reform and just governance of empire. He wrote extensively, published his memoirs, and remained a controversial figure, celebrated for his military genius, but criticized for his radical politics and his role in provoking the conquest of Sindh. His military legacy was secure. The Battle of Miani was studied in military academies. His tactics, concentration of force, aggressive action, turning defensive positions through flanking attacks, became part of British military doctrine. Officers who wanted to study the art of winning against numerical odds studied Napier's campaigns. His political legacy was more complex. He had demonstrated that conquest followed by just governance could create stable rule and genuine popular support. But he had also demonstrated that imperial powers could manufacture pretexts for war, conquer territories that hadn't actually threatened them, and then justify it post facto through good administration. Whether this made empire moral remained a profound question that Napier himself struggled with until his death. So why has the Battle of Miani, one of the most lopsided military victories in British history, and Charles James Napier, arguably one of Britain's most brilliant field commanders, faded from popular memory? Why do most people know about Waterloo, Trafalgar, and Rorke's Drift, but draw a blank at Miani? There are several interconnected reasons. First, the moral ambiguity of the conquest. Unlike battles against Napoleon, clearly a threat to British interests, or the Zulu Wars, where the British were defending an established colony, however dubiously acquired, the conquest of Sindh was obviously a manufactured conflict. Napier provoked the war. The emirs hadn't actually threatened British India. The entire campaign was imperial expansion dressed up as defensive necessity. As British public opinion shifted over the decades following the conquest, becoming more skeptical of pure imperial expansion, Miani became harder to celebrate. It was a brilliant military victory, but in a morally questionable war that made it complicated to commemorate. The famous Pekavi Punhi, if Napier actually sent it, captured this ambiguity perfectly. "I have sinned" was simultaneously a boast of conquest and an acknowledgement of moral questionability. That kind of self-aware irony about imperial conquest became increasingly uncomfortable as the British public's relationship with empire became more complex. Second, not the final decisive moment. Miani was spectacular, but it wasn't strategically decisive for the empire as a whole. It secured Sindh, but Sindh was a relatively minor province. The conquest didn't fundamentally alter the trajectory of British power in India the way that, say, the Battle of Plassey, 1757, or the suppression of the 1857 rebellion did. Popular historical memory tends to remember either the founding moments of empire, laissez-passer, or the dramatic endpoints, the mutiny, the world wars. Mid-century colonial expansion, however militarily brilliant, gets compressed into a general narrative of, and then Britain conquered more of India without much attention to individual battles. Third, geographic and cultural distance. Sind was far from Britain, and the Baluchi warriors who fought so bravely at Miani never became well-known figures in British culture. Contrast this with the Napoleonic Wars, fought in Europe against a famous enemy, or the Zulu Wars, which created famous opponents like Shaka and Cetshwayo, who captured British imagination. The Amirs of Sind remained nameless to most British people. Their warriors were respected by those who fought them, but were never personalized in popular culture. Without a famous enemy, the battle itself becomes less memorable. Fourth, overshadowed by later events. The 1840s in British India were followed by the far more dramatic and traumatic events of 1857, the Indian Rebellion, called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British. This massive uprising, its brutal suppression, and its political consequences overshadowed earlier conquests. When people thought about British military action in India, they thought about 1857 and its aftermath, not about relatively small campaigns in the 1840s. Similarly, the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, occurring just a decade after Miani, captured British attention because it involved war against a major European power, Russia, rather than colonial conquest. The disasters and heroism of the Crimean War, the charge of the Light Brigade, the siege of Sevastopol, Florence Nightingale, became the dominant military narratives of the mid-century. Fifth, Napier's controversial personality. Napier himself was difficult to mythologize. He was brilliant but abrasive. He was a military hero but also a radical who criticized British society. He conquered Sind, but also wrote extensively about the obligations of empire and the injustices of British rule in other parts of India. He was too complex, too self-contradictory to fit neatly into Victorian hero narratives. British society preferred its military heroes to be either dashing and apolitical, like some cavalry officers, or stoic and duty-bound, like Wellington. Napier was neither. He was a thoughtful, politically engaged, sometimes angry reformer who happened to be a brilliant general. That complexity made him less suitable for simple commemorative narratives. Sixth, the changing scale of warfare. By the late 19th and certainly the 20th century, warfare had changed dramatically. Miani was fought with smoothbore muskets, cavalry charges, and infantry squares, tactics that would become obsolete within decades. The Crimean War introduced rifled weapons that changed battlefield dynamics. The American Civil War demonstrated industrial warfare. By World War I, warfare bore no resemblance to the tactics Napier employed. As warfare changed, earlier battles seemed quaint or irrelevant. Modern military historians could study Miani for its principles: concentration of force, aggressive action, breaking enemy morale. But to the general public, it seemed like ancient history, as distant from modern warfare as medieval battles. Seventh, the professionalization of military history. Paradoxically, as military history became more professional and academic, it became less accessible to general audiences. Professional military historians never forgot Miani. It remains a case study in how to win against numerical odds, how to turn defense into offense, how to exploit enemy psychology. But academic military history reached smaller audiences than popular military narratives. Books about Wellington, Nelson, or later figures like Montgomery or Churchill reached mass audiences. Academic studies of Napier's campaigns reached military professionals and historians, but not the broader public. Eighth, India's independence and changing narratives. After Indian independence in 1947, the entire narrative of British rule in India was reassessed. In Britain, there was discomfort with celebrating colonial conquest. In India, there was little interest in commemorating British military victories over Indian forces. Miani fell into a gap, no longer celebrated in Britain, never commemorated in Pakistan, where it took place, and irrelevant to Indian nationalist narratives that focused on resistance to British rule, not British victories. Despite these factors that led to Miani's obscurity, military historians have never forgotten Charles Napier or his greatest victory. At military academies, Sandhurst in Britain, West Point in America, and others worldwide, Miani remains a case study. The lessons it teaches remain relevant. That numerical inferiority can be overcome through concentration of force at decisive points. That aggressive action can disrupt enemy plans and create psychological advantages. That leadership requires personal courage and the willingness to share soldiers' dangers. That understanding enemy psychology and command structure can reveal exploitable weaknesses. That sometimes the bold approach, while risky, is actually safer than cautious alternatives. Modern officers studying asymmetric warfare, where forces of different sizes and capabilities meet, still learn from Napier's example. The specific tactics may be obsolete, but the principles remain valid. In the end, the Battle of Miani and the broader conquest of Sindh deserve to be remembered, not uncritically, not without acknowledging the moral complexities, but remembered nonetheless. Here's why. Remember the day itself, February 17th, 1843, when 2,800 soldiers defeated 30,000 warriors through discipline, leadership, and audacity. Remember it as a demonstration that training, morale, and tactical skill can overcome overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Remember it as an example of the terrible effectiveness of military professionalism. Remember the human cost, the 62 British and Indian soldiers who died in the battle, each representing someone's son or husband or father. Remember the thousands of Baluchi warriors who fought bravely to defend their homeland and died for it. Remember that military victories always have a price paid in human suffering, and that cost deserves acknowledgement even when celebrating the achievement. Remember Charles Napier himself, brilliant and flawed, convinced of his own righteousness yet genuinely trying to govern justly, a product of his time who nonetheless questioned many of its assumptions. Remember him as an example of how military genius and moral complexity can coexist in the same person. Remember the Baluchi warriors. They were brave. They fought skillfully within their capabilities. They were defending their homeland against foreign invasion. They lost not because they lacked courage, but because they faced an enemy with superior technology, training, and leadership. Their courage deserves respect even though their cause failed. Remember the broader context. This was part of British imperial expansion, often motivated by strategic and economic interests rather than defensive necessity. The conquest of Sindh was manufactured to some degree, a deliberate provocation justified post facto through good governance. That moral ambiguity is part of what we should remember. History isn't morally simple, and pretending it is serves no one. Remember the aftermath. Napier did try to govern justly by his era's standards. He abolished slavery. He implemented land reform. He built infrastructure. He created legal protections for ordinary people. Whether this justified the conquest is a question each person must answer for themselves, but the fact that he tried to make conquest serve justice rather than just extraction matters. Remember the military lessons. Sometimes at critical moments, individual actions matter enormously. Sometimes conventional wisdom is wrong. Sometimes the bold approach, while risky, succeeds precisely because it's unexpected. Sometimes leadership requires putting yourself in danger to inspire those you lead. These principles remain relevant regardless of one's views on empire or military force. Remember the complexity. There are no simple heroes or villains in this story. Napier was a military genius who provoked a questionable war. The emirs were autocratic rulers whose defeat nonetheless represented the loss of local autonomy. The British soldiers and Indian sepoys were following orders in a campaign they didn't choose. The Baluchi warriors were defending their homeland in a battle they couldn't win. Everyone had reasons, everyone made choices, and the outcomes affected millions. The Battle of Miani demonstrates something that transcends its specific historical moment. That warfare is about more than numbers, that leadership matters profoundly, that moral complexity attaches to almost all military action, and that history is made by humans making difficult choices with imperfect knowledge. This is our history, not just British history or Pakistani history or military history, but human history. It's worth remembering because it shows us something about human capability, our capacity for courage under impossible odds, our ability to overcome terrible disadvantages through skill and determination, our talent for warfare and all that implies about human nature, and our capacity to try to build something just from something violent. Charles James Napier stood in the Sindh desert on February 17, 1843, faced with an impossible choice. He chose audacity. He won a spectacular victory against overwhelming odds. He then tried, imperfectly, controversially, but genuinely, to govern justly. His name has faded from popular memory, but his achievements, his complexity, and his example remain relevant. Sometimes history forgets the wrong people. Sometimes brilliant individuals fade from memory, while lesser figures remain famous due to accidents of narrative and commemoration. Charles Napier was one of Britain's most brilliant generals, and his greatest victory deserves to be remembered alongside Wellington's triumph at Waterloo and Nelson's victory at Trafalgar. Not because conquest should be celebrated uncritically, not because empire was moral, but because human achievement, even in morally complex circumstances, deserves recognition. Because tactical brilliance, personal courage, and leadership under pressure matter, regardless of the cause they serve. And because understanding how one man turned impossible odds into decisive victory teaches us something valuable about human potential. The sun rose over the Sindh desert on February 17, 1843. By noon, Charles James Napier had rewritten British military history. That day, that achievement, that complex human story, this is worth remembering.